Please join me to welcome Ambassador James Lee for his opening remarks.
You turn off? Oh, okay. President Williams, Chair deLisle, Professor Lewis, Ms. Thibaut, Mr. Wu, Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends from the media, friends also from different community. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to everyone joining us here tonight for this important event. Firstly, I would like to thank Foreign Press Association for the opportunity to co-host tonight's discussion on countering disinformation and election interference. As Thomas Jefferson once said, a well-informed electorate is a prerequisite to democracy. We are gathering here to talk about a topic at the center of today's political discourse, separating fact from fiction and information from disinformation. The global election of 2024 will see the participation of around 60 countries, including the most powerful and the most populous nations such as the United States, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, and the EU collectively represent nearly half of the world's population. Taiwan being on the front line of coordinated attack of disinformation and election interference may offer useful lessons from our experience for other nations. China used Taiwan as a test ground for election interference in other democracies, aiming to reshape the rule-based international order in its favor. Though facing military intimidation, economic coercion, and pervasive disinformation campaign from external actors at its recent election, Taiwanese voters have shown resilience in safeguarding the integrity of its democracy. Bolstering by our dynamic civil society, our electorate have become increasingly adept and media literate. With robust fact-checking mechanisms in place, voters can access accurate information to make informed decisions. Taiwan's experience underscores how critical collaborative efforts are in tackling this challenge. According to the New York Times, a Chinese influence campaign known as Spain-Mafrage is using AI-generated image and a network of social media accounts to amplify American discontent and divisions ahead of the US presidential election. To counter election interference in the complex digital age, I think media literacy is the answer. Taiwan has helped other countries enhance their ability to combat disinformation and election interference by hosting a series of international media literacy workshops under the GCTF, Global Framework and Training Cooperation. This effort have helped raise awareness about malign influence operation, foster collective resilience, and thus defend democracy. And tonight, we are privileged to have a panel of esteemed experts who will share their wealth of knowledge and expertise on countering election interference and disinformation while upholding the principle of democracy and freedom of expression. So thank you again for joining us. and I hope you will find our panel discussion useful and insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Mr. Ian Williams, would you please take the floor? Thank you.
Hello. Don't make me stand, please. I'll fall over probably. Thank you, the Ambassador and staff at TECO here for providing us with a venue, logistics, and refreshments, which I hope we can mingle and network afterwards. Foreign Press Association has an obvious interest. Taiwan has an obvious interest. It's just had an election that was besieged and beset with interference, electronically and otherwise. And I suppose waving missiles from across the strait does count as interference in its own way, primitive but effective. For us, the foreign press are the first targets of interference in elections, or the press are, because the aim of the influencers is to get the press to repeat their lies, which is why it's very important that we have seminars like this so we can see what are lies and which is disinformation and which is skewed information. And it's very difficult to distinguish and disambiguate, as they say on Google, is it? I've been reporting on elections all over the year. I've even been in one myself. I lost for Liverpool City Council. And it just shows interference. My name begins with W. I was at the end of the ballot. I lost by 50 votes. So, you know, I'm very conscious of how things can be interfered with. But this year, there's very important elections across the world. And it's good that the elections are back in fashion. But what's fascinating is that some people who don't believe in elections are so interested in them. In Moscow, in Belarus, in Beijing, there are people who don't believe in elections, but they believe in everyone else's elections if they can work on them. And it's up to us to try to pick the lessons from what they're doing. We know that they have technologies of social control, which are being picked up by people across the world. There are software, there are surveillance, there are means of influencing people. And these are easily transportable technologies. So we have to try and make sure, and one of the purposes of today's seminar and the others that Taiwan has been running, is so that we can share the sort of prophylactic technology, how to spot what's happening, how to turn it around. We need to introduce the panelists because we want it as short as possible. We have a distinguished list of speakers, some of whom I've been with before. And when we're looking at the issues here with Taiwan, we have to remember that Taiwan is a miracle. The first time I went to Taiwan, it was just transitioning from a dictatorship under Kuomintang. And now it's a vibrant and healthy democracy, much beleaguered. But then I look at the surveys that some of our participants today are showing, and it's almost like they've transitioned 200 years of constitutional history in one leap. There are people in Taiwan every bit as gullible as American voters after a mere decade or two, who believe what they believe what their party tells them to believe, no more and no less. And are influenced because now with electronic media, it doesn't take that much. One of the stalwarts of democracy in this country, Mark Twain, famously said that a lie will be halfway around the world before the truth has put its boots on. And that always comes to me. When you see something and you study, as I do, you see the ripples going through the internet, you see where a story started, where it goes to, who repeats it, who amplifies it. And that's what we have to do as the media, we have to make sure we're not amplifying lies, that we're censoring them. Not censoring them, that's the wrong word. We're filtering them. We're commenting on them. And in the end, we're the only ones that can do it. So it's a very important job for us. And we have to get onto our panelists quickly, because it's a short session in which the history of democracy from Athens onwards will be encapsulated, won't it? So first, we have Min-hsuan, also known as TT-Cat. He is the co-founder and CEO of Doublethink Lab, which is an ominous-sounding operation, where he focuses on mapping China's online information operation mechanisms and combating digital authoritarianism. As an activist and campaigner for LGBTIQA+ rights, environmental protection and digital rights movements, he brings a unique perspective to our discussion. So if you want to roll off on that and show people what we're doing.
All right. Thank you so much. So, hi everyone. I'm TT-Cat. I'm represent for Doublethink Lab. Doublethink Lab started in 2019 September. We're mostly based in Taiwan. Our work is focused on the Chinese influence, PRC influence around the world. So we build a global community with our like-minded partners, and we publish the report, and we have a event, and also helping our partner to understand how Chinese influence operation in all kind of aspect. And in our own organization, we host the research for information operation particularly. So we look at the what we call cognitive warfare or psychological warfare, how they use the disinformation and propaganda to influence our voters. And we work with a fact-checking initiative, but ourselves, we don't do fact-check. We are checking that where those information coming from and how they're amplifying, and whether they have a coordination effort from different group. Yes. All right, so this election, we just had an election in generally, so that's why you're here, and thank you so much for caring about it. This election, we had a task force with our own analysis and with 30 interns, and we look at across the whole election period and try to documenting what kind of suspicious incidents. And today, because of the time, so I cannot introduce you everything, but I will show you some case that TECO want me to highlight. Right. Okay. So one thing I want to share is that one tactic we've been seeing as a new tactic is that they are more and more willing to create this like fake public opinions. So for instance, they will create this like a Twitter accounts, and they use this Twitter account to say something, criticize our government. And they took a screenshot and post it or amplifying to their media outlets or Facebook fan page, and to get a wider audience. But if you go back to see all these like Twitter accounts, there are only have like 2 followers, or all these Twitter accounts are created at the same time. But what this like illusion they want to create is that you see this is a random Taiwanese people's opinion. They don't satisfy about our government, something like that. And the more and more we see that those disinformation or information campaign, they happen very close to the voting day. So for instance, like a week before the voting day, or 10 days before the voting days, 5 weeks before the voting days. One story I want to show you today is this food security, related to food safety. So they're talking a lot about like our food shortage, or the food has a poison. For this case, it's like our import eggs. They say not only there's a shortage, after the shortage, okay, so the shortage is also fake, right? So they are saying there's a fake shortage, so people are panicked, so the people get more egg in their own own house, so they create actual shortage. And after that, our government tried to import more eggs from the foreign countries, and then they start to say the egg is poisoned. Why I'm showing this case is because all this story is particularly amplified by the state media from China, so they care about our eggs more than regular people here in Taiwan. There's a lot of amplifications, and in this case we publish it on our Medium. There's a report. You see even the PRC in their press conference, their diplomatic press conference, they are talking about our eggs. And of course they created a lot of TikTok videos, short videos, and saying the egg have a lot of a problem. And also they are relate to some kind of a US skepticism for all these kind of things. Import eggs, import pork from the US, and they are saying that this is like we are paying the US for the money for to exchange the protection, something like that. You see, they have this like coordination. They use the same means for different platforms. They use the same means, same content, same keywords, same hashtag group, and go on and on. And then they spread all these things to a lot of other group. So I'm going to skip all these like slides, just give you interesting, but. Right. Another case I want to show you is, is something happened a week before the voting day. There is a, the week before the voting day, suddenly there's a story come out to all the platforms, like all the social media platforms. They even send the spam mail to random Taiwanese people. Some people just participate in an online survey, and after that, he started to get a lot of a spam email. The email saying that there's a book circulating online, e-book. It's talking about Tsai Ing-wen, which is our current president, has a secret history. This secret history is saying that how she used her body to get her status and power today, and of course it's all fake. And not only that, they created thousands of the YouTube channels and put the content. You see, we are voting at January 13. On the January night, there's a lot of a YouTube channel just emerged. And what is special is that they are using a lot of a generative AI tool to create this content. For instance, they created this like a AI generated TV news anchor. They can speak in Chinese, even Cantonese. And this tool is available online, and it's produced by ByteDance, which is the company that created TikTok, for everybody to use, right, actually. But they created this like a kind of like an authentic, right? So they make you falsely believe that this is a news. And what are they reading? They are reading a book, e-book. They say you can find it online. So we try to find it. Oh, sorry. Another thing is that all the accounts who post this, their profile photo has a perfect align with their eyes and the mouse precision. This is also AI generated profile image. And when they tweet it, they have a perfect timing aligned with the Beijing time zone from the 8 a.m. in the morning to the 5 p.m. Afternoon, and they have a lunch break here. So when we found the Word file and we tried to export the Word file to the plain text .txt file, because the picture inside the Word file is not going to export, right? So you can actually see the picture, the file name, and their path in the original computer. So you see there's a simplified Chinese computer. At least it's made by some people use the simplified Chinese Windows computer. And all this like, it's kind of like a novel, and we suspect that this novel is also generated by the AI. Right. So in the result, we also do the pre-elected survey. So something I want to show you here is that we asked a lot of we asked the voter a week before the voting, and asked a lot of like a narrative, that common narrative from the China or disinformation we sought, and we tried to ask that whether they believe, disagree, or agree, right? And one of the questions you see from here is that this one, question number 23, is that the current ruling DDP government is no different from the Chinese Communist Party and the Taiwan lack of the freedom of speech. Yeah? KMT, which is a poor engagement with the China party, out of the 70% of their supporter actually believe that. And also TPP supporter, which is a new third party, also over the half believe so. So because we have a very short time, and I'm really looking forward for more conversation and question if you have, and hopefully to have more opportunity to share more cases with you. Thank you.
It reminds me, didn't they recently find that there's a bot farm in Russia where they took every military holiday off? And then it was shown because the transmissions didn't go through those days.
Yeah, and
it's fairly obvious.
Yeah.
Yes.
During the Lunar New Year, no Chinese working, so it's our most peaceful time.
Yeah, so they're not very sophisticated in some ways. But, but on the other hand, it gets through to a lot of people.
Yes.
And do you want to move on? And then we'll consider the PowerPoints together? Oh, you have your mic.
I do have my mic. I
Go
can
on
go.
then.
Okay. Yes, sir. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Really excited to be here and to talk to you about this. My name is Kenton Thibaut. I'm Senior Resident Fellow for China at what's called the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, which is a mouthful. Today I've been asked to talk about some of the cross-sections between disinformation, information operations, and generative AI. I focus on China, so I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of China's information operations, and then I'll talk a little bit about a little bit about the history, but mostly what we've seen in the past couple of years, and this really dovetails with advancements in what we now call generative AI. So I'll kick it off with next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So actually, before starting, I just want to kind of set the stage and say that in general, one thing that makes it a little bit easier to maybe study Chinese influence operations is that there are some core kind of meta narratives that we can kind of expect to see that fit into, I'd say, 3 or 4 major buckets. So in terms of how and who China targets with these different narratives, the first bucket would be what we would refer to as the quote unquote global north, industrialized Western nations for the most part. The main goal of the narratives that China seeks to deploy in these contexts is to weaken the US-led alliance system. So as an example, using the signing of the AUKUS agreement, which was the nuclear submarine agreement between Australia, US, UK, taking that and really deploying some narratives in France about how they can't trust the US. The alliance system is really all about backstabbers, et cetera, et cetera. That's one example. Another example is to kind of, within certain countries in the global north that it deems to be its adversaries, to try and increasingly sow the seeds of doubt in their own kind of democratic political systems. Increasingly, we've been seeing China take a much more active role in seeking to intervene in the US domestic political system, for example. Previously, it had not, starting in about 2018, 2019, and especially after COVID, seeing a lot more willingness to kind of interfere a la Russian-style tactics in kind of the political fabric of the US. Global South, China's messages are a lot different. They're all about really kind of promoting China's model as being superior in terms of delivering public goods and being effective at governance and delivering goods, and really kind of embracing this, development first perspective that kind of resonates with a lot of Global South audiences. Another key narrative goal is to really undermine the global leadership of the US and the legitimacy of the US as leading the current international order. Lastly, towards the diaspora, that's another big bucket, really emphasizing messages of ties to the motherland. We're all kind of one big family. We see this directed at Taiwan a lot, but also for diaspora across the world. And then lastly, we can always kind of expect activity around what China terms its core interests, things that touch on territorial sovereignty especially, and very much Taiwan is definitely an example of this. So with that little backdrop, key events really drive China's influence operations activity. And I say influence operations instead of information operations right now because IO is very much, information operations is very much focused on the sort of digital aspect of things, but influence, as you know, can span, economic, political, social, et cetera. So China's IO activity, its information operations activity, can really kind of be traced back to around 2016. That's when we see some of the first networks being created on Facebook, and these were largely in response to the election of Taiwan, which China saw as really potentially challenging the status quo in Taiwan. Yes. We saw some kind of network building, digital infrastructure building out of that election. Another key event during that time was when the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that China's activities in the South China Sea was illegal. So actually this first network, which Graphica wrote a report about in 2020, really was focused on first denigrating President Tsai, but then kind of switched to focusing on South China Sea issues, spread a lot of disinformation in the Philippines about the South China Sea. And so then that's kind of when we first started seeing China, engage in this kind of activity. A number of key events really pushed China to turn to more global messaging. So right now we're kind of in what it thinks of as its sphere of influence. But a number of events really pushed it to kind of do a more global messaging and be more entrepreneurial in its narratives. One is 2017 and 2018, when the global community really started paying attention to accusations of forced labor in Xinjiang. This really, by all indications, kind of caught some officials by surprise, the degree to which this issue kind of took on salience in the West especially. And they really saw this as, the coverage of this as really quite threatening and really felt the need to kind of counter what it saw as these narratives that were really damaging its reputation. Another thing that we see during this time is China really trying to assert with multinational companies, kind of cracking down on any sort of even the semblance of recognizing Taiwan as a potential independent kind of entity. We saw this for different airlines that listed Taiwan as a country, Marriott that was listing Taiwan as a country on its website. So these are some driving factors there. In 2019, Hong Kong protests really saw a big push, a lot of building out of infrastructure, seeing a need to really resource this a lot more. And then especially during COVID is when you really saw global messaging really blow up, and a lot of kind of intention, resourcing, official kind of like writing on this, a real kind of focus on really needing to push narratives and kind of take control of the narrative about China, really kind of start to gain momentum. Post-2020, competition with the US, AUKUS, tech curbs from the US and export controls on China's tech sector, Taiwan's the visit to Taiwan by Nancy Pelosi, Russia-Ukraine war. These are all other key events that have really been driving China's push to kind of push out narratives, build out its infrastructure, and engage in this kind of activity. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit of the history and some trends that we've been seeing, especially in the past year or so. And especially since, so if you kind of know a little bit of the history of ChatGPT, it came out in around November 2022. China had at the time started passing some regulations on machine learning algorithms. And then when ChatGPT came out, those had to be kind of retrofitted to take into account generative AI. Machine learning is kind of, belongs in the sort of internet 2.0 realm, and generative AI really has brought us into kind of the 3.0 realm. So what we've seen in terms of China's influence in information operations activities is really an expansion to new platforms and languages. So previously we saw a lot of this activity taking place on the classic Facebook, X, YouTube. One of the latest takedowns announced by Meta in August 2023, there were over 50 platforms, and it was the largest network in history that Meta has taken down. And also a real prevalence of China state-linked social media influencers. There were 230 of them across 40 languages, including new languages and platforms. So this is really, these kind of stats really show that there's an intentionality behind this. It's being resourced. There's experimentation there, and there's an intentionality around really kind of making this a centerpiece. Well, not a centerpiece, but really a core component of their toolkit for influence. Another trend is more sophisticated tactics to increase engagement. And I will say, and also obfuscate the source of different disinformation materials. So the increasing use of generative AI images that TT-Cat just kind of just showed. We call them GANs, gaming hashtags and writing on popular hashtags. So for example, taking a hashtag that would say, well, we saw this during the A4 protests. They're on Twitter, any sort of hashtag that had the word Shanghai in it would be attached to basically a spam post that had later been linked to state affiliated networks, so that anybody trying to look up information about the Shanghai protests in Chinese would immediately just kind of be flooded with spam. A second thing is programming fake accounts to use first person. So instead of these sort of spamiflage dragon accounts that we were kind of talking about earlier that would just retweet, really trying to take on more of a first person persona. And also obfuscating sort of the sources of different propaganda pieces. So for example, using screenshots of Chinese state media stories in lieu of links to avoid labels on platforms. For example, it used to be on X, or Twitter, if you posted something that was from, People's Daily, it would automatically come with a label that it was from a government source, a Chinese government source. So to get around this, still on Facebook they do this, to get around this, the accounts will just kind of take a screenshot of a People's Daily article and post it so that it avoids being labeled and thus avoids being taken down. Another thing is using fake academics to enhance legitimacy. And one of these examples here is from an ASPE report. And this is, they traced how they basically traced China's build out of digital infrastructure in Southeast Asia and how they were being used to, these kind of crime groups were being used to create fake accounts and spread disinformation, or to just kind of like flood the zone to distract people. Another thing is elaborate, what we call information laundering techniques. One example of this, basically information laundering is trying to obfuscate the source by making what was the original sort of thing that the original piece of disinformation have sort of 4 or 5 steps removed from the original source so that you don't know it's disinformation. And the example here was a fake think tank that was found to be created by China that produced this fake report that purported to show that the actual origin of COVID was in Fort Detrick in Maryland in the USA. And so instead of actually linking to this sort of fake report, what would be done is that the state-linked actors would write blog posts about it, or have videos on it, and then repost those blog posts to certain sites, like a live journal. And then that live journal would then be the thing that would be cited in further iterations of the disinformation chain. So you couldn't on first glance go and look at that original source and see that it was kind of spurious. Another kind of trend is increasingly using freelance websites to recruit unwitting people to engage in protests, to engage in kind of pro-China activities without really understanding what they're doing. One kind of famous example is a China state-linked group, an LLC that was backed by Chinese money, was used to hire a Baltimore musician to stage a Black Lives Matter protest outside of what was the kind of international religious conference that was being held in New York. And I think that was featuring some Uyghur participants. And so this man was hired to kind of do a protest outside of that to kind of distract from what was going on, and also highlight US hypocrisy on the persecution of African Americans while having a freedom conference. And this is a perennial theme in China's narratives about the US, is that there's hypocrisy because of the treatment of African Americans. So lastly, China's increasingly engaging in what we call reflexive control theory type tactics. And this is something that's been written about in sort of the academic literature on Russian disinformation. Reflexive control theory is basically the idea that you don't need to really create any new narratives. What you do is you exploit existing tensions within a society and just kind of promote them and let that narrative kind of take a life in and of itself. This comes from the idea that one of the ways that you win a quote-unquote smokeless war is by weakening the enemy from within. And part of the way that you do that is by really exacerbating existing social tensions, because those are also going to be much more effective than a fake narrative that you kind of inject into an information space. So what we've been seeing, at least in the US context, is a strategic shift from mostly pro-CCP merit, and not necessarily just the US context, but a shift from mostly pro-CCP messages, a shift from trying to win folks over to the CCP side, to amplifying discord within competitor countries on political and social issues. And another thing is to couple online and offline techniques. This really kind of focuses on transnational activities, covert activities, really using sort of Chinese platforms and apps to track dissidents or members of the diaspora, and really kind of use different information technologies coupled with influence activities to harass, spy, and try to censor folks who are sort of seen as not being spreading favorable opinions. Okay, so 2024 and beyond. So this is something that I at DFR Lab really focus on a lot, and us in the China section really focus on a lot, is the increasing use of generative AI tools with classic techniques and tactics to increase the difficulty of attributing campaigns and lowering labor costs associated with this activity. Previously, it took kind of a lot of labor to conduct these kinds of campaigns, right? You had people who needed lunch breaks. They needed to go on holiday. One of the kind of sea change things that we think we might see with generative AI is the ability to kind of have this be fully automated, and automated in a way that is not just spammy, but potentially quite believable. One sort of potential risk of the use of generative AI tools is astroturfing, what we call astroturfing, which is kind of swarming the information system with a particular narrative. The reason why it could be a sea change with generative AI is that if you create personas that are really believable, that seem to be like you, that speak the language that you speak, you can query different generative AI tools to speak like a Southern person who's a fan of NASCAR, right? So if you have someone like that who you're kind of connecting with online and who's every once in a while giving a kind of political opinion, and once you aggregate that into the hundreds of thousands, then it could potentially shape the political discourse in a way that makes it seem like this is where things are going, this is what people are talking about, and really kind of undermine the organic democratic process in a country. Again, this is kind of like worst case scenario, but these are some of the harms that we think of and think of how to mitigate when we're thinking of the use of generative AI and disinformation. Let's go back. Yeah, okay. So a few things to note, I'm almost finished, is the PLA is currently assessing how to best incorporate generative AI in war planning. Again, this came out November 2022. China's really struggling with its own large language models, mixed measures of success. But we see in official writing, they're really thinking through how to integrate this. The traditional media is also experimenting with using things like ChatGPT to write better tailored content. AI plus sentiment data can be used to better target audiences, both with narratives tailored to their interests and also to write better tailored content. Oh, and to conduct surveillance. So for example, if you have a bunch of people tweeting in a certain location, you can kind of track where they are and then crack down on them, for example. Expanding access to data resources abroad, so you building data centers, building ICT infrastructure, and then using that to gain access to data resources that are then fed back into the Chinese system. As we know, with training AI models, the diverse data is best for getting more robust models, so this is part of that planning. And then using AI tools to aid in cyber-enabled I/O. So OpenAI recently came out with a post that was saying that they took down some networks of malicious state actors, and they were using ChatGPT to debug code and generate content for phishing scams. I use ChatGPT to debug my code, so I don't have to get shamed on Stack Overflow, so I know this is a really good use of ChatGPT. But if you think about it, you can hire people who maybe have a rudimentary knowledge of code, get them to use and understand how to query ChatGPT, and then they can really become kind of more sophisticated actors and coders. So what we worry about is kind of an up-leveling of existing capacities and kind of a supercharging of some of the things that we already see with classic disinformation. One key vulnerability that we still have is some inconsistency of monitoring and takedowns across platforms. A lot of our understanding of their tactics, of threat actors' tactics, come from this, and so this is kind of a vulnerability going forward. Hopefully I didn't scare you too much. I may have gone a couple minutes over my 7 minutes allotted, but I'll pass it back to Ian to bring it to the next panelist. Thank you.
It's a bit disturbing. The answer seems to be we have to have better bots than them. No. No. It's different. Okay. Professor Margaret Lewis, Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Institutional Operations at Seton Hall University, where she researches on law in China and Taiwan, with an emphasis on criminal justice and human rights. But I thought law on China was a bit slender as a research subject.
You've got two law in China people up here, so
okay.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm always delighted to be here with friends from Taiwan and coming in from New Jersey, which is also the hometown of the incoming vice president, which we're very excited about, those of us from across the river. So I'm Maggie Lewis. I specialize in law, not on the technical side, and fascinating to bring those levels together of people who are thinking more about these issues in the legal world, civil society. I am not Taiwanese, but I've spent a lot of time living and working in Taiwan, and with so many worries, I think my first sort of reaction is that Jacques and I were in Taiwan in January for the election, and with all the sort of glass half empty and concerns. It was a wonderful time to be there. And as an American who is very concerned about what happened here in our last election and what could happen in our next election, the polls closed at 4 p.m. We went and actually took part in watching the vote counting, which is open and you can do that. Within a few hours, it was clear who won the presidency. The other candidates admitted they lost. The next day we got up, went to breakfast, and everything was fine. So, I do think there's a lot to celebrate in the process. And I also recognize that today is Arba, right? It's February 28th, which of course is now, I guess, the 77th anniversary of the massive massacre that kicked off the White Terror and decades of dictatorship in Taiwan. And so to think how far Taiwan has come, and it is vibrant, overused, but it is true that this idea that there's been such hard battles to have freedom of speech and have all these human rights protections. And I really appreciate that civil society and the government does work together so much on this. So just a few reactions, and one going to this reflexive control theory, which I love that term, this idea of amplifying existing concerns or fears. I mean, that's something I very much feel and see when I am in Taiwan, and just a few examples of that. First with food safety. I mean, for years it's been concerns about the racto pork, right? Pork with ractopamine, which is to make it leaner, but there are concerns, particularly quite amplified, not here, US, we're eating racto pork all the time, but in Taiwan, but that is a concern that's been there for a very long time, and then China and others have been able to feed into that and take what was an existing concern and increase it. Secondly, recently in particular, we've seen this concern about the memorandum of understanding between the Taiwanese government and India over migrant laborers. And for Taiwan, which is a very diverse place in many ways, but there have been for a long time concerns about migration, and particularly from Southeast Asia. And you see a lot of the people working in jobs that are difficult, dangerous, a lot of elder care, very demanding, in cleaning these, if you're gonna have fabs and have these amazing semiconductor industry, you need a lot of people doing the work to keep them clean. And a real, I think, tension about immigration, that there's a lot of benefits to immigration into Taiwan, and the need, especially given that Taiwan has the lowest birth rate in the world, which, lower than Singapore, lower than Japan, but at the same time, that concerns about what that means to have people coming in from outside. So having this agreement with India, there was something to tap into that then was turned into disinformation about, like, this is going to be dangerous and scary, and there's going to be this influx of people coming from India. So again, taking something that was there and blowing it up and turning it into a real divisive issue in society. And then third, this what we really saw when we were there for the election, this idea of American skepticism, this imelun, this would the U.S. really have Taiwan's back? And of course, the U.S. is under the one China policy. There is some question about what the U.S. would do, and strategic ambiguity has been in place for a very long time. And I wonder, especially given what might happen in November, would the U.S., overall become more isolationist? But that concern about how much the U.S. really was invested in Taiwan's security was really amplified by the KMT as well as by outside actors. And then it's just another thought that comes from all this, thinking about the cooperation of government and civil society, sort of what roles they play together and separately. And as a lawyer, I do see that there is a role for government here to think about to what extent do you have laws that are perhaps restricting speech in some ways, but are necessary and at least helpful to try to make it so that there's not just a flood of disinformation without any constraints, which goes to this concern that is certainly brought up against the DPP, that they are constraining free speech. Also that there's been such great work in thinking of the ways to do the fact checking, which is, Doublethink is doing the work and figuring out where the disinformation is coming from, but then the organizations like the Taiwan Fact Check Center, MyGoPen, CoFacts, which are giving individuals the tools to try to root out whether what they're taking in is really true or not, especially when it's like grandma on the line chat where, you know, it's all sorts of different disinformation. And part of that came from the hacker community. And that I found really interesting, how you have a vibrant and celebrated hacker community in Taiwan that is feeding the innovation in the sphere. And then just finally, I was thinking that this has been a busy week for me. I'm an associate dean now, which means I have tons of meetings. But I've been working with the faculty and thinking about how implicit bias comes into our teaching and what we can do about it. And one of the techniques to address implicit bias, which we all have because we're human beings, is to not give in to overconfidence. To think like, well, other people have it more than I do, and I'm doing great, right? And I think with the disinformation, I'm increasingly trying to recognize, just to be humble, that just because I have X number of degrees or whatever that doesn't mean that I'm not someone who could fall prey to it, because it goes to our emotions, and especially now with the generative AI, that it can be tailored in a way that I think there's a real sense of humility and being aware that we all need to be vigilant and not sort of think that we're cleverer than that disinformation. So I think I'll stop there and pass it over to Jacques.
Jacques, maybe you can relate this to the wider issues, because we are moving into the wider world. How Taiwan and other countries in the South Pacific consider themselves secure obviously has geopolitical implications.
Okay, well, thanks. Pleasure to be here as always. As that last remark suggests, it would be a bit of disinformation to portray myself as an expert in disinformation. So I'm going to try and put these things in a bit of context, both in terms of what China is up to with Taiwan and in the region and beyond, and what some of the lessons might be for the U.S. To build on some of the things that Maggie just said. So, I mean, I think what you've heard from the first two colleagues on the panel here is part of a toolkit or a quiver full of arrows that China has for dealing with what it sees as the Taiwan problem. And there's a real spectrum here. It runs from flat-out coercion, gray zone activities, military exercises, things like that, through economic and social carrots and sticks, sort of sanctioning, cutting off trade preferential access to certain exports on the eve of the elections, favoring certain geographic districts over another in terms of economic opportunities, the opportunity to influence students and business people through coercion and through opportunities, that's all part of it as well. Some of that shades over into persuasion. And then there's a long-standing, and it's still there, elaborate state and party-state apparatus in China. The propaganda department of the CCP, the United Front Work Department, the Taiwanese and others who they tried to bring into to institutions, even some vestigial things in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. So there's that structure there, and it still goes on. And Taiwan is partly targeted by that. Then we've got the stuff that gets into what we're talking about here. And even within the disinformation, misinformation, amplification of problematic information stuff, there's quite a spectrum. We've heard about it. There's content creation, the 50-cent party, the small pinks, the content farms, things like that, which are Chinese-linked content creators, and then the ones that are truly state-based. And then there are the sort of fake news and bad news amplifiers. Some of it's collaborators within Taiwan, some of it is people who unwittingly resonate with what's being said and get drawn into it. We've heard about all that. But I think it's important to see this as a really broad spectrum, and of course the AI things make it a lot worse. But this is not scattershot, as Kenton suggested, that this is part of doctrine, even PLA doctrine, the three warfares, right? I mean, they're shooting, but the three warfares for winning without shooting, winning without fighting, are lawfare, which we could talk about, but it's not our topic today, psychological warfare and public opinion warfare, and this speaks to two of those three warfares. And it really is an attempt to wear down Taiwan's confidence and resilience collectively and to divide Taiwan internally, and those obviously dovetail with one another. It's an attempt to build the idea that resistance is futile and the outcome is inevitable, so just give up now. And that's where a lot of this goes, either because China's going to win or because you don't have the ability to stand up or to draw the support that's needed externally. So I think, in a way, Taiwan, what's going on in Taiwan, if we look at the election interference and the information stuff in that space, Taiwan is the canary in the coal mine or a great test case for a variety of reasons. One is it's a super high priority for China. It's its #1 target for these sorts of things. And China has special leverage, the economic ties, the cultural access, and just the years of investing in it. And what China is up to with the information warfare, as it were, the disinformation, is it hits Taiwan in a place where it erodes one of Taiwan's great international strengths. If it corrodes democracy, if it corrodes the belief in these values, that takes out from under Taiwan much of what gives it stature and draws support in the world. And it exploits the weakness that is the obverse of that strength. That is an open society where there's a reluctance to do content regulation, a reluctance to cut oneself off from international media and foreign presence. And if you try to regulate, as Maggie suggests, it may be worthwhile, but you're going to get blowback, and the DPP has certainly gotten that blowback. So there's a lot potentially to be learned from Taiwan by other democratic states, and here I'm confining myself to the slice of similar states, so-called like-minded states, including the US. And so what can we learn from what China's been up to? Well, it's no longer a game about using argumentation to intimidate, to scare people, to bully them. Some of that, but it's not central. And it's not about persuading to how wonderful China and its agenda is. It is in the global south, but I think that game's been lost mostly in the global north. So what you see is, as Maggie also suggested, and as everybody else has suggested, is a sort of pushing on the open doors. Go after the weak points. And what are the weak points in Taiwan? They actually parallel what I think are a lot of the weak points in America. Min-hsuan, right? Taiwan should be suspicious of whether the US is going to show up. The argument is it's a dangerous world out there with people you can't trust. The US is doing bioweapons in Taiwan. The US is getting TSMC hollowed out. The US is making Taiwanese eat dangerous ractopamine pork. The US really made Russia do it when it attacked Ukraine, so you can't trust the Americans, and they won't show up anyway. Well, that's actually not that different from what you hear in the US. We don't trust our allies, the narrative goes, from those who are buying into the disinformation that's being propagated. So why should we have any skin in the games? And of course that becomes a feedback loop, right? That becomes the kind of thing that lies behind the US holding up aid to Taiwan and others, Ukraine and Israel as well, and the turn sort of toward isolationism that then feeds the Min-hsuan narrative, and it keeps going back and forth. Secondly, the declining confidence in democratic institutions and processes. Really pushing on that button, and you've seen it, the 300-page tome on Tsai Ing-wen, basically going after the idea that Taiwanese leaders are not honest, they don't have integrity, right? The education degree is faked, they got where they are by sleeping their way to the top, they're illegitimate children, they're not really looking out for Taiwan's interests, instead they're taking some sort of, they're lapdogs of the Americans, and so on. They bungled COVID, or they tried to cover up COVID. Or more legitimately, they're not doing a great job of dealing with social and economic issues that are motivating voters, particularly young voters. All of that sort of works, and you're sort of hitting themes that are already out there. And here too, the US has parallels, right? Joe Biden's senile, it's a criminal family. The Soros people are behind all this. I mean, it feeds the same view that the government is out for itself, it's corrupt, it's incompetent, and it is selling out the national interest for parochial interests and perhaps foreign interests. And mostly, well, I'll do a bit of misinformation. Abraham Lincoln is often misquoted as saying that if America loses, it will only be because it destroys itself from the inside. He actually didn't say that, but that gives you an idea of how good misinformation is. And that's basically the game, is to create corrosion from within. And so the tactics are now less immediately partisan, less transparent, and there's less clarity about what's a foreign influence and what's domestic resonance and sympathy, and that makes it very hard to go after. The other thing I think we're seeing is targeting youth. We see a lot of that, and there are a bunch of possible reasons. One is young people are less politically formed. There's more opportunity to shape them with this stuff. Another is that they're more dependent on social media, which is a very vulnerable platform for doing this kind of thing. But a third is they're kind of pre-disillusioned, right? They're not a happy generation around the world right now, and so they're much more susceptible to these kinds of critiques. So what can we learn from Taiwan's response to these things? Well, you've heard much about it. Taiwan has the give me a fish approach, that is, expose the particular postings that are problematic, the particular sources that are problematic. What's interesting is that the NGOs and the techies and the government have gone a bit beyond that to media literacy, civic education. That's the teach me to fish. I can figure out how to spot something that's bad. I can plug it into, was it anti-mail or something? Yeah, or the AI chatbots or all that sort of thing. And there's some room for collective action in the form of regulation by government. The problem is that can target some stuff, but it doesn't target the really sneaky stuff. You can ban foreign ownership of media, you can ban foreign donations to campaigns, but that's not really going to put much of a cork in the bottle, and the other stuff, as Maggie points out, is tough. And my hat's off to the Taiwan techies. They've been very good at this. I would rather have the techies in Taiwan than, say, Elon Musk, responsible for dealing with disinformation in social media. But the real defense ultimately is to have a society that is sophisticated about this, and Taiwan's, I think, made greater efforts on that front, and a society that thinks it's important to resist this sort of thing. And I think there's ample evidence that at least much of Taiwan has that in a way the US does not. Put simply, if Taiwan gets this wrong and messes up its politics and its democracy, it's an existential problem. We can do politics as infotainment for a long time. It's going to take a long time before we pay the price for that. One final point I'd make is that we talk about this in a relatively generic way. This phenomenon is not symmetrical across party lines. We tend to see it go against the party in power, but in Taiwan to a degree, you see in some of the polling statistics on the PowerPoint, in Taiwan to a certain degree and in the US very clearly, one party is much more willing to engage in the democratic subversion than the other and seems much more susceptible to the misinformation. And if we both sides it, I think we miss an important dynamic here that we kind of have to grapple with, even though it leads us back down the path of seeming partisanship and content discrimination. And that's kind of the fix we're in.
I could easily get quite depressed. When you're answering, just in general, I'd like, is this, to what extent is this a coordinated plan? To what extent is it spontaneous on the part of useful idiots across the world rallying to the red flag for the occasion? I've studied the 30s and I've studied since then. I studied the disinformation over the Balkans, for example. And it was very often useful idiots volunteering because they were so indoctrinated, they believed this stuff and they had to push it across. So, have some thoughts on to what extent this is being directed and or maybe it's like a jazz orchestra, it's conducted as they improvise.
I defer to those who do the empirical stuff on this a lot, but as a general matter, I mean, Occam's razor says go for useful idiots rather than elaborate plots. It's cheaper, it's easier, it's probably more prevalent. But Taiwan does clearly have people inside Taiwan who are agents of the PRC, but at least from what I've seen from presentations like today's and earlier ones I've seen in Taiwan, a lot of this is it just resonates with people and they run with it, or they just get overwhelmed with it and starts affecting their thinking. So again, it's not, you needed a fifth column when you were trying to overthrow something. If you're just trying to weaken something, it's enough if people just get turned off and talk to one another and resonate in the echo chamber. And that's a lot of what's going on. I mean, if you go back to China's efforts, 96 was missiles, don't vote for Li Donghui, right? 2000 was Zhu Rongji waving his finger to the same end, and then it was, oh, we're pro-KMT. That's still there, but it's really faded to the background of what is much more a, hey, DPP, the KMT sucks. Hey, KMT, the DPP, how bad they are? They're going to sell. So it becomes that dynamic, and that is much less a bring you over to my side than just break the whole thing. And on that, I think the useful idiots are more useful.
Yeah, so I think this is a reflection of kind of how information operations are carried out by different entities within the bureaucracy. So at the very top level, you do get some guidance from the propaganda department and the Cyberspace Affairs Commission, which is primarily responsible for telling social media companies and the media what to say about certain things. So for example, when the sort of fire broke out in that city in Xinjiang and people were trapped inside and the building burned down, there was a directive that was issued, and these are all China Digital Times is a great organization that has a repository of a lot of these leaked directives. So a directive was issued by the CAC on what to say about the Xinjiang fires, but also gave out instructions to the kind of propaganda departments within different social media companies to, okay, everybody needs to flood Weibo and with pictures of beef noodle soup with the hashtag of the city in Xinjiang that was affected by the fire. And so this is like a way that the social media feeds get flooded with news that keeps you from accessing the actual facts on the ground. There's other parts of the bureaucracy that are tasked with carrying out different information operations in different regions. The PLA has a unit within it that is specifically responsible for Taiwan, focusing on Taiwan because Taiwan's a priority, and they're highly professionalized. Where you do see kind of this sometimes like funny, weird stuff is with maybe like the public security bureaus that have their own information operations officers. Sometimes they'll mess up, and also you have commercial actors where you have like different propaganda bureaus contracting out to different commercial actors, like the one I was talking about, the kind of spammy criminal network that just do very low quality bargain basement kind of activity. So it really depends. Sometimes we can't predict how these different things interact and like the results of them. So it is kind of decentralized, even though kind of directives come from the top. I don't think that was your question, but I just went off on it.
It was a nice answer. I'm happy with the answer. It's I was just thinking of Mao Zedong People's War as applied to as applied to intellectual techniques. I'm getting questioned about questions and answers from the floor. Hello, floor. Do you have any questions? Please. Yes. You win.
Okay, great, thank you. A question about election interference globally. In Taiwan, it seems pretty clear what kind of outcome China would want. But what about other countries? Are there some clear examples that you can think of where China had a candidate that they want, or a party that they clearly wanted to win, and they made that effort, like in Indonesia recently, or in the upcoming Indian elections? Is there a clear outcome that Beijing wants that you're seeing playing out?
Well, I cannot comment on specific one. Sorry about that. But just last couple of days, people are, talking about which candidates in the United States that Xi Jinping will more willing to see elected. I think that's an interesting question, right? So we've been seeing that a lot of the countries, especially after the COVID, we see a lot of the countries actually switching the side, especially like Philippines or Korea, their government is changing their attitude and more willing to work with the U.S. or spoken for Taiwan issues and everything. And I doubt whether that's Xi Jinping want to see or not, right? So one scenario that I consider to be thinking is that whether, when he posed a lot of threats or tension or to Taiwan, like they fly in those jets, the result is always opposite. Like Taiwanese people will feel like we don't like that, right? So they will tend to vote for the one that they don't like. But they should know better. In 1996, they fired the missile. We vote for. We have a rocket high voting rate already. They should know better, but they still do it. So either they are stupid or they intentionally want to create those tension and create this like a conflict, right? So sometimes I don't have an answer, but sometimes I also wonder whether or not they want to choose someone will create more chaos, more isolated, or more lack of the international collection, or more. They want to create this like chaos world, like or to justify to their own people that you see every country is bullying us. It's kind of like a Qing dynasty that all the Western country united and bullying us. They want to create this and to show their people that I'm the only one can protect you and protect this like a great China dynasty. So that's some.
Yeah, I can't speak too much to the to disinformation attempts in particular jurisdictions, but we do know cases where China clearly has favored candidates, and the more open tools that have been in the mix. So, I mean, obviously they preferred the KMT to the DPP in Taiwan. We know that one. Clearly, Duterte to Marcos was not a good move for China and the Philippines. I don't think we know much about, at least I don't. I'm sure my colleagues may know more about what they've done there. My sense is China, has a lot of capability to do subtle things in Taiwan and in the very near abroad, and that falls off fairly steeply. And the public diplomacy is so ham-fisted in many of these places that I suspect the hidden stuff may not be super developed. Two places where you do see, I think, clear signals of favorites. One is in Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies, there's real favoritism for the pro-China party where that's become an issue, and it has been in several elections recently in Caribbean and South Pacific countries. So China clearly is, it's making its preferences felt and is offering money, basically, as well as doing other things. So there is some evidence of information manipulation there. The attitude toward the U.S. has been complex. For a long, long time, China basically liked continuity. Whatever party's in power, just stay there, don't rock the boat. They got a little curious with Obama and thought, hey, maybe a change. They wound up leaning Trump because of, Hillary, human rights. You don't want women leaders. Trump can be dealt with. He's a businessman. Maybe he'll hasten American decline. So there were like 18 different reasons that the Chinese foreign policy intellectuals and policymakers were leaning Trump in 2020. And it ranged from we can deal with him to he'll precipitate American decline. I think that switched back by 2020. The sense was, the reset didn't happen post 2020, but I think they're still leaning a bit Biden, just because by 2020 they were so fed up with the headaches and the chaos that they rather liked the idea of change and hoped for a reset that then didn't happen. So this time, purple state China, but I think it's leaning a little blue.
Simon?
Any specific takeaways from Taiwan? You're talking about media sort of literacy in terms of population understanding or being able to recognize potentially what is fake and what is disinformation. Are there any things that were done in Taiwan that helped individuals have a better understanding that this might be disinformation, or is it in essence the more sophisticated folks and the government ultimately looking at it and saying, we actually need to expose what is disinformation? Are there takeaways from that?
Well, I'm from Taiwan, right? So of course I feel like we are doomed there. So probably the panelists there, they will feel more shining. They will see more shining light side of the Taiwan. There's some efforts, of course, and some policy like our government. They will, if there's a particular disinformation that is related to our government, different agency, they need to respond in, I think, 2 hours. There's a policy for 224, so they need to respond to 2 hours with 2 different means, which is like a picture and everything, something like that. So basically, like a quick response and provide the materials to the audience, especially to their supporter or media, to use those material to try to stop and prevent a get further expanded. But in the people's, there's a lot of civil society try to do different effort. Fact checking is one thing, but also there's I would like to share this story. So a couple years ago, there's a group of the volunteers group. There's just like a couple young people. They feel like this disinformation problem is too big. They really want to contribute. So they start to hosting the banner and and they set out a table in their neighborhood. And they start to tell the elder people or other people who passing by, say that, hey, do you know you can receive the fake news in the WhatsApp or Line? And what's the disinformation? And they do this like a pop quiz. And if you participate, they give you free soap or like small gift, something like that. So they go to the like a hiking site park to try to reach out to those people are not easy to reach on the internet, right? they are not thinking they can fix the whole problem in the whole country when they start. But a year later, they have like a 500 or even more volunteers to do this kind of like attempt in everywhere, right? So and they be invited to all kind of like community center to give the speech to the elder people, senior people, and they become more impactful. So I'm start to thinking that sometime I will like to share this story. Is like maybe there's no one solution to solve everything, and when they start, they are not thinking that I'm going to fix this once for all. They are thinking that I'm going to contribute to the community I can reach as a start. So yeah, that's something I would like to share. But we also have a lot of a challenge that we cannot fix by our own self. A lot of things you are seeing on our cases is happening on the platform that is owned by the US company here, right? Like YouTube, like a Facebook, or like a Twitter. After Elon Musk, it's like unreachable. We need to pay $5,000 for a month to get a 1 million tweet from their platform. And those tweets is generated by our own voter, our own citizen, talking about our own election. And we do those research, and we need to spend those resources on it, which is absurd because they just shut down the API and free API at all to the researchers. And I think that's a lot of the things that we cannot deal with that alone by Taiwan, and we definitely need the people here to partner with. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get U.S. social media to be the most responsible, but we hope, we'll see how the Supreme Court does next. But also the Chinese platforms like TikTok, of course, Xiaohongshu was coming up more. But one thing I found interesting is the first time I went to Taiwan was about 20 years ago, and so we were not talking about any of this, obviously, but there were the issue about how children were taught history was something that I found fascinating, because that is oftentimes we're seeing that in the U.S., but there how the martial law period was taught and who was in power, what was in the textbooks, how the history of the White Terror movement, and so I think too it's interesting when you think now, and I don't know to what extent how the children are being taught, and I say this as a parent of a 9 and 11-year-old, but this is something that's not new to Taiwan in some ways because the past has been so contested, and how you not just as adults deal with that, but how you teach the next generation. So I think that's a lot of this is what we've been talking about is sort of amongst at least teenagers who are on their phones, but this is something which goes all the way down to the elementary schools as well.
There's older technology here as well. I mean, in the Philippines, apparently they came and nobody knew anything about the dictatorship under Marcos before this election. It had been completely wiped from the school curricula. So, people voted. Now, whether or not we visit the sins of the father on the son and say that this Marcos is the same as the older Marcos, but it was a complete whiteout. But on the other hand, I remember when I first came here, I think there was a study at Amherst about television, which showed that there was an inverse correlation between Americans' knowledge of foreign affairs and how much they watched television. The less they watched, the more they knew. And I'm wondering whether the internet has been measured in the same way. To what extent, the frittering on the internet will destroy people's knowledge of history because you're not getting it in organized blocks, you're not getting it in a systematic way. It's coming as a sort of piecemeal pointillist picture with lots of dots thrown on the screen by lots of different actors, in which case the useful idiots win all the time because they're out there putting it. I was about to say it's the end, but Kristen, how could I fail?
I'm wondering what you're looking towards in terms of trends, concerns, worries for the 2024 elections in the United States, and I think it was Margaret who made some allusion to perhaps having the need for different kinds of regulations to deal with interference in social media. Are there any real proposals out there to deal with this issue that you think it would be useful? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I cannot directly predict what will happen here, but I have two points I would like to make. One is that I would like to remind everybody here is that the cognitive warfare or psychological warfare or using the disinformation propaganda to influence other countries, this is static, that is written in PLA's textbook, right? So it's written playbook, textbook, they are teaching their own people, this is what they're going to do, and they invest money, resource to it. So in what degree that in our own national defense strategy, or like how many money budget we spend defense that kind of a tactic, because you can also think it about this is kind of a gray zone tactic too, if they are using this like a propaganda in war as the war, one of the tools for the war. So I think thinking about this, if you put that into this framework, thinking about how much resource we need to put in to defend this kind of a strategy to influence our society, and how much we already do it, how much we lack of it. I think that's the one thing sorry, I would like to say. And second is the TikTok, right? So talking about TikTok, I know there's a debate about the freedom of expression, because we have that debate too, and our debate, the people's argue even more is like, you see, US didn't ban the TikTok, so why would Taiwan need to ban TikTok, right? So, but I think TikTok is not about the freedom of expression. It's about thinking about if this is ancient Greece or Rome, that we have a general assembly in a physical space, that, but the physical space is in a third country, which is your enemy's country, and then facilitator is their people. They can decide who can speak, how longer they can speak. They can decide whose microphone is louder enough for everybody can listen, or what you're saying is only two people six next to you can hear, right? So I'm thinking that I'm consistently advise our politicians that don't use TikTok as your main source to get the traffic or popularity, because TikTok can ban your account, or they can downgrade you, they can shadow ban you, they can do everything to, yeah, so if you react or depend on the platform that is not controlled by there. So yeah, I think that's with the generative AI we already talked about. So I think that will be something we will see more and more in Taiwan or in other places here.
I just have one quick thing on elections, just in general. I would say, and back to the previous question on if we expect interference by China. I'd say that currently, I mean, we have seen China put out like its normal sort of propaganda talking points. Even in the US context, they tried to put out like different videos across a number of platforms, you know, attacking Biden, Marco Rubio, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd say that we should think of this more as like like what China sees as an opportunistic time to try and shape or influence the debate, rather than thinking of the election in and of itself as like an opportunity to directly interfere. Usually pre and post election is when we see a lot of threat actor activity, sowing narratives, and then in the aftermath of an election really exploiting whatever social tensions come up. But at the same time, China will intervene where its interests dictate. For example, if China becomes a really hot topic in the presidential debate, we can expect some sort of activity online and offline to counter narratives, to put forward a different narrative, to try and manipulate the information environment in its favor. Another kind of caveat to say though, or not a caveat, but like a warning, is that we shouldn't do China's work for it. And I'm just talking for the, the US context as well. We shouldn't talk about the specter of foreign interference so much so that we start to think of it as something that is inevitable, or to use it as a basis to question the integrity of our elections. The 2020 election was one of the most secure ever. So just at the same time that we're aware of the potentials for it, we shouldn't do China's work, or not China's work, but do a threat actor's work for it in that respect. So that was my little spiel.
I've taken this on board because whereas before I would have said none of the above, I've realized this is playing into the Chinese narrative to get people disinterested. I'm afraid I saw some hands, but we can continue the discussion upstairs at the reception over refreshments. But any time that's now taken from down here is time taken from upstairs, from the refreshments. I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is a welcome revival, hallelujah, after the years of COVID. And we like to see more people together like this and to get more social interchange, which is why we want to go to the reception. People talking to each other. And without TikTok, without Facebook, I get so confused. Where did that message come from? I mean, if God sent me a message now, I'd be checking my computer to see which channel it came in on. So it's getting very confusing for all of us. But thank you very much from TECO and from the Foreign Press Association for being here. It's been an interesting discussion, a frightening discussion, and awesome in the sense that we're all awed by it. And it's going to be a hard year, I think, for everybody here and India and everywhere else. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Bye.